Hello, this is Mrs. Standridge. I'm here today for another chapter of Elijah of Buxton. Now, I want to mention something that we've talked about in class before, and that's foreshadowing. If you remember, foreshadowing is a technique that authors use to give us a hint of something that might be happening later on in the book. Now, earlier in the book, Mr. Leroy was holding his arm, his left arm. Does any of you know what that means when you have pain in your left arm, especially for a man, an older man? Sometimes that may indicate that you might be having some heart trouble. Now, we're going to be reading this next chapter, and I don't think that I'm giving you any spoilers because the title of the chapter is The Death of Mr. Leroy. Let's find out. I said it afore, and I know there ain't many folks who are going to agree with me about this, but riding a horse ain't nowhere near as good as riding a mule, especially when you're galloping hard down a bad road heading for Windsor. Especially when you know the man you're riding behind ain't got no intention of stopping till you're on the ferry that goes across the Detroit River. Especially when it feels like they'd gone and stretched out the road twixt Buxton and Windsor by another couple 100 miles. Why, I was getting bumped round on Jingle Boy so much that I knowed those glasses of milk Cooter's ma made me drink had gone and churned theirselves into a big lump of butter in my belly. And whilst I's mighty fond of butter, it ain't nowhere near as good tasting if the way it gets in your belly is as milk. All I could do was squeeze my eyes shut, mash my face into Mr. Leroy's back, hold on tight, and hope that all that butter weren't going to try to fight its way back out of my throat. Big and hard as it had got, it wouldn't probably come back out without a whole lot of choking involved. I wanted to holler up at Mr. Leroy that maybe he was running Jingle Boy too hard, but like he told me, it was like a ball had started rolling down a hill and weren't about to be stopped. After the longest time I could smell water, and Mr. Leroy eased up some on Jingle Boy. I opened my eyes and saw we were in Windsor at the end of a road that had a big ferry sitting on the river. Me and Mr. Leroy jumped off, and once things inside of me quit shaking, I patted Jingle Boy's chest. He was sweating something fierce and breathing hard, like it was a cold, cold winter day. He looked at me like he was wondering how come I let Mr. Leroy pound him that way. His eyes were as wild as a hurt deer's. I said, "Mr. Leroy, sir, we ran Jingle Boy way too hard. He's about to die, sir. I best take him down into the river and water him and cool him off." Mr. Leroy said, "Depends on when that ferry's leaving. You go ax them white men. Horse gonna be fine. Y'all up here baby him too much." I said, "Yes, sir, but maybe you should take him down to the river, Mr. Leroy, and maybe you should take a dip too. You're sweating just as much as Jingle Boy." I didn't tell him, but his eyes were looking just as wild as the horse's too. The white men said the ferry weren't leaving for 45 minutes. I told Mr. Leroy and took Jingle Boy right on into the river. He dropped his head down and drank long and hard, blowing bubbles up all round his mouth. I found a bucket with a hole in it and used it to scoop water up on his flanks. They shivered and shook, but I knowed he liked it. After a while he quit drinking and started breathing regular. Mr. Leroy called out, "Elijah, bring that horse on up here. We got to be first on, so we's first off." I took Jingle Boy back up to the landing and told Mr. Leroy, "Sir, it ain't no use to run Jingle Boy this hard. If he dies or pulls up lame, it's going to take us twice as long to get up to that village and 3 times as long to get back to Buxton. I know this horse, sir, and he ain't up to hours of hard running like this." Mr. Leroy looked out across the river at Detroit. He said, "I suppose you're right. We ain't going to push him as much from here on." That near about took my breath away. Those were words of respect. Here I weren't nothing but a child, and he saw what I said was right and agreed to go along with my plan. I guess it's like what Cooter's ma said, that I'm a lot more grown and smarter than most folks my age. Once we got off the ferry in Detroit, I looked back over to Canada. I ain't disputing that I'm a whole lot smarter than most other children who are near about 12 years old, but I couldn't for anything see how come a river made so much difference. How could one side of the river mean you were free and the other side mean you were a slave? When you looked at the trees in Canada and the trees in America, they seemed to be the same trees, like they could have come from one seed. Same with the rocks and the houses and the horses and everything else that I could compare. But the grown folks could see big differences that weren't plain to me. Mr. Leroy kept his word, and whilst the shaking was still worse than it would have been on old Flapjack, it was tolerable better than the ride to Windsor. The logging village was about 5 or 6 times as big as the square in Buxton. Mr. Leroy told me to get the paper out that had the man's name on it who'd nursed Mr. Highgate. First person we saw that weren't white, he made me ask, "Excuse me, sir, we're looking for Mr. Benjamin Alston. He lives at 509 Wilbur Place." The man said, "That be old Benji. It's on down the road a bit, but you ain't gonna find him there. He most likely out back of the tavern this time of night." "Where's the tavern, sir?" The man pointed up the road and said, "Right yon." He told Mr. Leroy, "That's a mighty fine horse you got there, mister." Mr. Leroy didn't answer, so I said, "Thank you kindly, sir." Mr. Leroy was looking hard up at the tavern. He said, "What he doing out back of tavern?" "They's gambling. Stakes ain't much, but it's about all the entertaining you gon' find round here." Mr. Leroy said, "You hear tell if a man from Canada what call hisself preacher been gambling with anyone round here?" The man laughed and said, "A preacher what owns up to sinning, huh? Ain't heard of no such man in these parts. Naw, that would have stuck with me." Mr. Leroy pulled his coat aside so the man could see the preacher's pistol and said, "He's toting a gun same as this one here. Same holster, too." The man smiled and said, "Oh, him. Yes, sir, he was gambling up here a while back. He done cleaned all these here fools out, then went looking for some bigger fish to fry. Last I hear, he went on over to gamble with some of them white men. I don't know where they playin' at, but one of 'em behind the tavern would." This was great news. Maybe the preacher had won enough by now to really buy 6 more slaves out of America. Maybe we didn't have no cause to come up here tearing after him. Mr. Leroy said, "Thank you kindly." He reached down to pull me onto Jingle Boy. 'Twarn't far at all to the tavern. When we got there, Mr. Leroy tied Jingle Boy out front and told me, "If they's any trouble, you light on out for this horse and go home. Just follow the road south." I said, "Yes, sir." He pulled the pistol out of the holster and put it in the pocket of his waistcoat. He never took his hand back out of the pocket. We walked round back of the tavern and came up on a bunch of men squatting down and talking loud. Once we got up on 'em, I saw the preacher warn't there. The men were tossing 2 little white square boxes with dots all over 'em up against a wall. There was lots of swearing and lots of coins being passed around and American dollar bills being waved back and forth and held squozed up in fists. Mr. Leroy said, "Pardon me, any y'all know a man name of—" He gave me a nudge. I took the paper out of my pocket again and read, "Mr. Benjamin Alston." One of the men said, "Who axin'?" Mr. Leroy said, "He help a friend and I needs to talk to him." The man said, "What friend he help?" Mr. Leroy said, "Man named Highgate, come from Buxton, in Canada." The man who'd asked all the questions stood up and said, "I'm Benji Alston. What can I do for you?" Mr. Leroy said, "Thank you kindly for helping Theodore, sir." "'Twarn't nothing. Someone bushwhacked him. All I done was give him a place to rest and call a doctor. That's one lucky man. Doc say a half a inch closer, he'd have been killed for sure. How he doing?" Mr. Leroy said, "I hear you might know where I can find the man what got a gun like this here one." Mr. Leroy pulled his hand out of his pocket. He had the gun pointing back at himself so no one wouldn't get the wrong idea. A bunch of grumbling and scowls came over all the men once they saw that gun. Mr. Alston said, "Hesh, couldn't none of y'all say for sure he was cheating? Man might have been having a good roll of luck." Someone said, "Luck my foot." One of the other men said, "He got done with us and said he was looking to bet for some real money. Said he wanted to go up against some of them white folks. They was gambling over in Culpeper's, but that was earlier this week. Shoot, I figure if that man was smart enough to cheat all us, he'd have to be smart enough to know better than to gamble with no white folks." Mr. Alston said, "Last I heard, he was over at the East Lee stable yesterday, but I ain't sure I believe it. That's where them slavers is staying." Slavers? My blood ran cold. Mr. Alston said, "Y'all best be careful if you plan on going over to that stable. Them paddy rollers there ain't to be trifled with. Got them one of the biggest, baddest bear-fighting dogs I ever seen up north." He told us where the stable was, and I thanked him. I don't know what it was, if it was the talk about the slavers or the talk about the bear-fighting dog. As soon as we started walking back to Jingle Boy, Mr. Leroy commenced to looking mighty worried and afeared, and it tore my heart out. I said, "What's wrong, Mr. Leroy? Should we go get us some help from somewhere?" Mr. Leroy grabbed his left arm and started breathing like he'd just been chopping oaks. He said, "Elijah, ain't no one gonna help me. It just be you. Ain't nothing in the world that'll get you feeling fragile quicker than seeing a grown person you know as hard as nails looking afeared." "But, Mr. Leroy, what's wrong? Why are you looking like that?" He said, "We got to get to that stable, boy. We got to move quick." He climbed up on Jingle Boy slow and in parts, 'stead of jumping up the way he regular did. He didn't put his arm down to pull me up. He said, "Lead the horse yon, Elijah, through the back way." I grabbed Jingle Boy's reins and led him north. We got about a half-mile when I said to Mr. Leroy, "Sir, maybe we should get you some rest before we go to that stable. Maybe we need to—" I looked back just as Mr. Leroy started sliding off of Jingle Boy. It seemed like he was moving so slow that he was sort of floating down toward the ground, like he was just going to settle soft and light as a feather. But when he landed on his face, there was a horrible, heavy thump, and things commenced moving again like they normal do. "Mr. Leroy!" I ran back and kneeled down beside him. His eyes were open, but he was blinking more than he would most times. I said, "Please, Mr. Leroy, please get back up." I shook him, and he said, "No, you got to go in that stable and get that money, boy. He done thiefed the money for your mother and sister, Ezekiel." Mr. Leroy was out of his mind. I said, "Please, sir, I ain't Ezekiel. I'm Elijah Freeman." He grabbed my arm and said, "Is you going to do it? Is you going to get that money, boy?" I started going all fragile. Things commenced loosening in my nose. He said, Promise me now." What could I do? I whispered, "I ain't Ezekiel. I'm Elijah." He said, Promise me you'll get that money, and if he done lost it, promise me you's gonna gut shoot him." "Please, Mr. Leroy, please get up. Please don't leave me here alone." He said, "Son, can't you see I'm dying? Please tell me you's gonna get the money for your ma and sister. That ain't much. Ezekiel, how come you ain't telling me?" His voice was getting softer and softer, and that was worse than if he'd been yelling. Finally I said, "I promise, sir. I promise I'll do it." He smiled and whispered, "Take that pistol, boy." I pulled the mystery pistol out of the fancy holster and put it in my tote sack. He coughed twice, and something dark and thick started leaking out of his mouth and nose. The last things he said were, "I love you, son. Tell your ma His eyes stayed open, but I knowed they weren't seeing nothing. I shooked him and said, "Mr. Leroy." "Oh, please, Mr. Leroy." I ran back to Mr. Alston to try and get some help. I busted right in on the men and yelled, "Excuse me, sir. Mr. Leroy fell off the horse and ain't moving." Mr. Austin said, "What you say, boy? Calm yourself down and don't be talking that fast." I catched my breath and said, "Mr. Leroy fell off the horse and ain't breathing." They ran back with me and bunched up round where Mr. Leroy was laying. Mr. Austin looked at Mr. Leroy and put his hands over his eyes to close them. He said, "Son, he pass. Y'all kin?" "No, sir." "Y'all's both from Buxton?" "Yes, sir." "You got anyone up here what can look after you?" I started to say no, but knowed if I did, and if Mr. Leroy really was dead, they weren't going to let me keep my promise. They weren't going to let me hunt the preacher down and get Mr. Leroy's money back. I said, "Yes, sir, my auntie lives just over yon." I pointed south. Mr. Austin said, "We're going to have to get the sheriff, boy. Tell your auntie she need to come claim him, else they're going to put him in the pauper's field." I said, "I'll have to tell my pa in Buxton. They'll come and get Mr. Leroy." I grabbed Jingle Boy's reins and never looked back. A promise is a promise, and I weren't about to let Mr. Leroy down. I was going to find the preacher if it took me 10 years, and I was going to start with the East Lee stable. So Mr. Austin and the other men wouldn't get suspicious, I headed south, pretending I was riding hard back to Buxton. All right, that's the end of chapter 20. So remember earlier when we had, when we found out about Mr. Leroy holding his arm and breathing hard? Like I mentioned, that's an indication of someone having a heart attack. So that was a bit of foreshadowing that kind of let us know before this happened that something was going to happen to Mr. Leroy. He wasn't well, and he might not make it, and we found out here he did not survive. So now it's up to Elijah to try and find the money so that he can help Mr. Leroy's relatives. We'll find out tomorrow if he does. Bye.